Thank you for coming in front of the committee. Help me understand, a lot of the recent criticism against the president is that he supports discrimination against country of origin, race, sex. And I-200 prohibits that. So this seems like this would go against the kind of criticism of the president if we allow this to happen. But more specifically, at least in other states, how this affects the Asian American community. They are frankly overrepresented in higher ed, because it's merit-based. It's not based on other factors. But if you allow discrimination, you find out that starts pushing down attendance for that community. Is that fair that one group is given advantages over others, and you start picking the winners and losers from the different communities of color?
I think advantages is a relative term, and I think that's the wrong frame to look at it. To talk about the state of the body politic in the United States when you've got President Trump out there, I've become a firm believer in Missouri's slogan, "Show me." And what do the numbers say, and where are we going from there? So we just see further exacerbation of income inequality and housing inequality, criminal justice inequality. In fact, to deal with some of those issues, for instance, right now we've got a bill, 5588, which is sitting on the floor calendar to do racial impact statements on felony convictions so that we can actually know before we start passing bills whether or not they're going to have disparately negative impacts on different communities of color. We need to know these things, but the data is showing that we're going the wrong way. So regardless of the rhetoric, and when we talk about discrimination, I think that gets back to my first answer to your question, which is that discrimination is the result of a power imbalance. So if you don't have power, it's impossible for you to discriminate. You're being discriminated against. And, the opposite of black and white, well, you can say, if you're not black, you're white. But there's so many different shades in between that, and it's not a black and white issue. It's about bringing equity back to the system.
But don't you find like this discriminates against the Asian American community? That's what the data shows.
Well, the data is, and certainly there are segments of the Asian community that is doing very well. But I think you need to disaggregate that data, because if you look at, and what it boils down to is economics. I mean, to have a shot in our capitalist system, you have to have an economic foundation on which to build your future. So when we're talking about the Asian demographic as a whole, I think that's doing an injustice to many of the newer immigrants. You take the Pacific Islanders communities, not to disrespect them at all, but they're coming from a much further back starting place than those of us who have been here for several generations now. So, we're going to be doing a Day of Remembrance recognition here on February 19th. And that historically is one of the high or maybe low lights of the discrimination that exists. It's taken generations for our community to recover from that, but the African American community still has not recovered from the historic slavery and the discrimination that they've had in the past. Most minority communities, I think that in our era of high technology, some within the Asian demographic have found a niche there. I will grant you that. But most of the Asian demographic is still struggling.
Is that the fickle finger of fate or what?
No, you have.
You want to make a quick comment?
I do want to make a comment. I want to submit for the record.
I have letters from the president of the University of Washington, the president of Washington State University, and from King County Council, and also a letter from the King County Labor Council, the Martin Luther King County Labor Council, in support of our efforts to take another look at this and to move this bill forward. So I'd like to submit those for the record.
Thank you. We'll do that. Senator Saldana.
Is that my understanding was that there is broader and broader support now that this has been 20 years. So this was when I was a freshman in college, when I-200 was on the ballot, and I had major fears of what I-200 would mean for the future of not just myself but my colleagues. And I think, to your point, the data shows, and I think even Seattle Times recently has made cases for consideration to repeal I-200. Is that correct?
Okay. I guess that's a yes. Senator Kuderer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Senator Hasegawa, your cartoon reminds me of something that my dad used to say to the 9 of us when we would complain that he was treating the other one more favorably. And he would say, fair ain't always 50-50. So I think while I-200 was very well intentioned, it misses the context. And this is what you and Senator Chase were providing for us today. And my question goes to the statistics. If we were to repeal this, what do you project will happen in terms of how quickly we can recover from this hole we've seemed to have dug ourselves into?
Go ahead. I have thoughts about that.
If I may. We would pass, in order to recover quickly, there are a huge number of public policy changes that we would have to see and that we would have to monitor. And we have been attempting to have an inclusive society for many, many, many years, and numerous people have worked on this issue. I don't think we can say it will ever be over, that we will successfully achieve a just and fair society. But we can try, and we have not been trying. It doesn't happen without some pretty strong guidance and an even hand. The invisible hand needs to come out and start getting and paying attention to the effect of our policies. You know, we talk about that we want a dynamic fiscal note, for example, to see what the impact is of our actions. We don't measure the impact of our actions in the aggregate. We will see, different empirical evidence studies that come out about different policies, but you can't just say, wave a hand and say, oh, it's all fixed, because we have destroyed the infrastructure that had been built up, for example, on the contracting. And it's a huge infrastructure to make an economic sector fair and just. We have to rebuild that. So it'll take a while.
And that's actually where I was going to go, is that I don't see anything changing anytime soon. What it does do is remove the barrier from success, but success still requires a supportive infrastructure, social infrastructure. So, for instance, if you refer back to this chart again, with the amount of spend that the public spending has declined to minority contractors, that means the infrastructure or those contractors have begun to fail. So if you notice the second from the right column, the number of certified minority contractors in 1998 was 1,121. And then when it had dropped to 1.66, there was only 378 minority contractors. How do we rebuild that whole infrastructure so that the community can succeed? That's going to take a lot of time, and the similar requirements for rebuilding infrastructure in the education system and housing our entire economy. It's going to take a long time, but what this does is removes that barrier and give our communities an opportunity to succeed.
And just by doing this, obviously there will be other legislative changes that we have to be made down the line. This is not instant change, so to speak.
So one example,
If I could, just a second,
might.
too. I want to hear from John Carlson, who is calling in. He's not there? Okay. If he's not there, we will... Okay. We're going to take a break for executive action after you two finish, and then we'll get John Carlson, who's the only person who's signed in opposed to this bill, and let him give his con statement.
Right now? Can I just do a quick follow-up?
Yes.
You were all in caucus, and maybe I don't know if I should share this, but all of these bills that come to the floor that talk about modifying our contracting opportunities, the processes that cities and local governments use, and remember I talked about that, but every time one of those bills comes up to try and streamline the contracting process, essentially people fought back in the 60s and 70s to make sure that we got away from that system. Now we're gradually going back towards that system. That's why I'm so attentive to when we see these changes, proposed changes coming to these municipal contracting processes, that I try to include, or at least make our caucus and the legislature aware that we are stepping backwards rather than forwards. Yes, it may look like streamlining, but when you're streamlining, the good old boy system is probably the most streamlined system there is. That's what we need to get away from and give everybody equity of opportunity. So I keep insisting on these amendments that sound like a pain in the rear, but I just keep hammering on those because I think it's very important for us to understand the consequences of those actions.
Keep on hammering.